Imagine the scene, September 19th, 1949. Britain's Chancellor rises in Parliament to deliver a history-bending message. Sterling, the unit that greased a century of world trade, the money that financed an empire spanning a quarter of the globe, is cut by 30% overnight. Not a tactical tweak, but capitulation. The empire that beat Napoleon, ruled India, and survived 2 world wars was financially broken. And here is the point many miss. Britain did not lose its empire on the battlefield, or to a sudden revolutionary tide. It lost it to debt. More unsettling still, the United States is tracing the same arc. Let's rewind to the early 1900s. Britain stood as undisputed superpower. The pound sterling served as the world's reserve currency and gave London what economists label an exorbitant privilege: the capacity to borrow in its own money, to print liabilities other nations willingly held, and to finance fleets, garrisons, and far-flung administration by exporting sterling IOUs. London ruled global finance. After a century of discipline following the Napoleonic Wars, public debt hovered near 30% of GDP. The system looked permanent too big to fail. It wasn't. World War I detonated the balance sheet. Government debt vaulted from roughly $650 million in 1914 to about $7.7 billion by 1919, more than a tenfold leap in 5 years. The gross war-era primary deficit was colossal. Britain flipped from the world's foremost creditor in 1914 to its largest debtor by 1918. The chief creditor was the United States. Gold stocks were drained, exports shattered, and money creation filled the gap. That was the beginning of the end of British monetary hegemony. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, the burden lingered. By 1934, London still owed Washington $4.4 billion from the Great War. British leaders argued they had paid in blood, and that the war debt web throttled recovery from the Depression. In 1934, Britain defaulted on those U.S. debts. Chancellor Neville Chamberlain quipped that not a dog barked, yet the long-run cost was heavy. American isolationism stiffened, and credit support would be harder to access when the next conflict erupted. World War II finished the job. Debt surged past 200% of GDP. At the 1944 peak, about 55% of national output was absorbed by the military. Exports collapsed. The home front survived on American aid and promises. Then came the trap. Sterling balances obligations to allies and colonies that had supplied troops, goods, transport, and food. By war's end, Britain owed over $3 billion in such balances, including around $1.25 billion to India and roughly $450 million to Egypt. John Maynard Keynes begged creditors to accept partial cancellation. Otherwise, Britain would be forced to abandon expensive outposts from the Mediterranean to the Middle East and Asia. He was right. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, President Truman terminated Lend-Lease. Britain had nothing competitive to export, few dollars to buy essentials, and no cushion. The government went to Washington cap in hand. The 1946 Anglo-American loan provided $3.75 billion at 2% interest from the U.S., plus $1.9 billion from Canada on conditions. The most punishing, make sterling convertible into dollars. When convertibility began in 1947, holders of sterling balances rushed to swap into dollars. Reserves evaporated within weeks, convertibility was suspended, and spending was slashed at home and abroad. 2 years later, on September 19, 1949, Chancellor Stafford Cripps devalued sterling by 30%. With that move, the pound's preeminence ended publicly and decisively. Debt did not just break the currency, it broke the empire. In 1947, India became independent, not because Britain suddenly embraced self-determination, but because London could no longer afford imperial administration and defense there. In 1948, Britain withdrew from Palestine. London also yielded leadership in Greece and Turkey to Washington, prompting the Truman Doctrine and confirming America as guarantor of the Western Order. The decisive humiliation came in 1956. When Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel launched an offensive. Initial battlefield results favored them, but the U.S. intervened financially, not militarily. Between October 30th and November 2nd, the Bank of England lost tens of millions in reserves. President Eisenhower threatened to unload U.S. holdings of sterling and blocked access to IMF support unless London accepted a ceasefire. Facing a monetary crisis, Prime Minister Anthony Eden stood down within days. The verdict was clear: military victory means little if your creditors can cut off funding. The decline continued. In 1976, another sterling crisis forced Britain to request a then-record $2.3 billion IMF rescue, conditioned on deep cuts to public spending. It was a national humiliation. 30 years later, Britain made its final World War II loan payment, December 29, 2006, sending $83 million to the U.S. and $23.6 million to Canada. The sums with interest roughly doubled the original borrowings. A nation that won the war spent 6 decades finishing the bill. Now to the United States. Britain's debt to GDP soared above 200% by 1945. Interest consumed huge slices of the budget, and foreign claims amplified vulnerability. Today, U.S. federal debt exceeds $33 trillion, around 130% of GDP, and in fiscal year 2024, interest outlays rivaled or surpassed defense. Projections show debt breaching $52 trillion by 2035, with cumulative interest around $8 trillion over 2023-2032. Military stretch: the U.S. operates hundreds of foreign installations, maintains forward presence in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and has spent nearly $8 trillion on the post-9/11 wars. Defense outlays approach $1 trillion a year and exceed the next several countries combined. Reserve currency risk also rhymes. Britain lost sterling status during 1944-1949. Devaluation followed the inability to defend parity once creditors demanded settlement in dollars. Today, the dollar still dominates, but its share of global reserves has slipped from the low 70s% toward the high 50s. Sanctions policy has pushed some countries to explore alternatives, from bilateral settlement to multilateral rails. De-dollarization is gradual until it isn't. Creditor dependence: Britain's lifeline was American loans. In 1956, Washington could dictate terms. By war's end, sterling balances held by India, Egypt, and others constrained policy. For the U.S. today, foreign investors hold more than $7 trillion in treasuries. China alone holds around $1 trillion portfolio. Coordinated selling pressure or a credibility shock could raise funding costs sharply at the worst moment. Niall Ferguson offered a rule of thumb: when a great power spends more on interest than on defense, its status is in jeopardy. By that yardstick, the warning light is on. The classic sequence goes like this: interest crowds out military capacity, commitments are trimmed, bases close, influence wanes. The U.S. retains advantages Britain lacked: continental scale, resource depth, secure geography, technological leadership, deep markets, and incumbency over the dollar system. Those advantages buy time. They do not repeal arithmetic. What to watch next? First, sustained episodes where interest costs exceed defense spending. Second, continued erosion of the dollar's reserve share and growth of non-dollar payment systems. Major commodity trades clearing outside dollars would be a tell. Third, forced retrenchment, inability to maintain forward bases, abrupt withdrawals, and fiscal policy bent by creditor pressure. Fourth, political dysfunction, gridlock that blocks structural reform, short-term fixes, and rising rollover risk. Britain's slide from peak strength to the 1949 currency shock took roughly a generation, 1914 to 1949. The United States has run sustained structural deficits since 2001. Deterioration feels slow until the break. In 1938, Britain looked durable. The WWII provided the decisive blow. For America, potential triggers range from a major war to a financial crisis to a coordinated move by large bondholders. The invariant lesson is simple: when debts outgrow the capacity to service them, while global commitments persist, the choice narrows to reform or rupture. Britain tried to muddle through partial defaults, stepwise devaluations, and an effort to carry imperial overhead. The result was serial humiliations, convertibility failure, Suez, IMF oversight. America faces a comparable fork. It can right-size commitments, fix fiscal mechanics, and stage a controlled glide from hegemon to first among equals, or it can drift toward a fast, externally forced reset. How does this touch your life? Currency devaluation torches cash savings. If dollar primacy erodes, dollar-denominated assets may be repriced. Living standards can compress under austerity. Strategic autonomy can bend toward creditor tolerance. Sensible defenses include diversifying beyond dollars, owning some real assets like productive land or precious metals, investing in skills that retain value across regimes, building redundancy in income and location, and watching the indicators before the herd moves. Britain did not fall to armies. It fell to math compound interest, external deficits, and a run on confidence. Those forces are universal. Any state that treats reserve currency status as a permanent entitlement invites the same fate. The bills always arrive. The open question for America is whether policy will move before markets do. Set the stage with specifics. In 1913, Britain sat on vast overseas assets and earned a large share of world invisibles, shipping, insurance, merchant banking. That external surplus financed imperial defense and covered import needs. War reversed every one of those flows. London sold foreign securities to pay for munitions, redirected shipyards to war work, and borrowed heavily in New York. By armistice, the city's net overseas position had shrunk dramatically, while the Treasury owed the U.S. billions at fixed rates. Returning to the pre-war gold parity in the 1920s compounded strain. Deflation to restore the pound's old value crushed tradables and kept unemployment high. The seeds of later weakness were planted in those choices. Sterling balances deserve a clear definition. During BIS II, Britain bought supplies, food, and services from the Empire and Allies by issuing sterling credits book entries in London that promised later payment. India alone accumulated about $1.25 billion, Egypt roughly $450 million. Other creditors included South Africa, Iraq, and various dominions. Those IOUs were liquid claims on Britain's post-war output or on its scarce dollars. Making sterling convertible in 1947 turned those balances into immediate calls on dollar reserves. The run was inevitable. Within weeks, the Bank of England bled dollars so fast that Whitehall slammed the door on convertibility and rationed imports. Rationing did not fully end until the 1950s, an astonishing fact for a supposed victor. The 1946 loans politics matter. Congress insisted on non-discrimination in trade policy and on convertibility. Much of the loan, despite public expectations, covered external military expenditures, keeping garrisons in the Canal Zone, maintaining naval stations, and subsidizing occupation costs. In other words, Britain borrowed abroad in order to finance an empire it could no longer afford. When the crisis hit, that edifice collapsed quickly. The 1949 devaluation from $4.03 to $2.80 per pound was not merely an accounting change. It admitted Britain could not defend the pre-war parity without strangling the domestic economy. Suez in 1956 hardened the verdict. Nasser's nationalization threatened a vital artery of trade. The Anglo-French-Israeli operation opened with airstrikes and a landing at Port Said. Markets, however, watched the reserves. From October 30th to November 2nd, the Bank of England lost about $45 million. The pressure intensified, as Washington signaled it would dump sterling and block IMF access. Eden accepted a UN ceasefire within days. Financial leverage beat force of arms. The crisis recalibrated British strategy for good. Henceforth, foreign policy would be nested inside the American security umbrella. Fast forward to 1976. Inflation, weak growth, and a sliding pound converged. The government could not roll its borrowing at tolerable rates. The IMF offered $2.3 billion, or the largest call to date, paired with expenditure cuts and monetary restraint. The episode etched itself as a modern humiliation, the lender of last resort, setting the terms of domestic policy in Westminster. Even the final page carried a sting. Britain's last WWII loan payments fell due on December 29th. 2006, $83 million to the U.S., and $23.6 million to Canada. Over decades, the total repaid, including interest, came out to nearly double the principal borrowed in the 1940s. Victors, it turned out, can pay for generations. Now map those mechanics onto the American case with numbers. Gross federal debt has crossed $33 trillion, with debt held by the public well past $25 trillion. Debt to GDP is roughly 120–130%, depending on the measure. In FY 2024, net interest payments approached $900 billion, on par with or above defense outlays. CBO baselines project debt above $50 trillion by the mid-2030s under current law, with interest the fastest growing the major line item. The arithmetic is simple. When your weighted average interest rate rises even modestly while your primary deficit persists, debt dynamics worsen mechanically. Defense posture is another echo. The United States maintains an archipelago of roughly 900 facilities outside its borders, from major hubs in Germany, Japan, and South Korea to smaller prepositioned sites across the Gulf and Indo-Pacific. The post-9/11 conflicts Afghanistan and Iraq carry estimated costs in the many trillions when veterans' care and interest are included. Sustaining forward presence requires steady outlays in personnel, procurement, and operations, and depends on market confidence to fund the Treasury at scale. On currency status, parallels require nuance. Sterling's fall was accelerated by fixed parities under Bretton Woods' predecessor arrangements and by the convertibility shock. The dollar operates in a fiat, mostly floating system with deep liquid treasury markets and global dollar liabilities. Even so, reserve shares move. The dollar's share has slid from roughly 70% at the turn of the century to around the upper 50s today, as central banks diversify into euros, yen, Swiss francs, Canadian dollars, and to a lesser degree into gold and the renminbi. Sanctions on major economies have encouraged the development of alternative payment channels, bilateral netting, and experiments in cross-border settlement platforms. None replaces the dollar yet. Each chips away at its monopoly rent. Creditor structure matters too. Foreigners own more than $7.5 trillion in treasuries. The investor base remains diversified central banks, sovereign funds, private institutions, but concentrated sellers can still shock term premia. A disorderly backup in yields would flow through to mortgage rates, corporate credit, and fiscal outlays, compounding the problem that caused it. The Ferguson heuristic captures the tipping point. When interest spending tops defense, strategic discretion narrows. You can tax more, spend less elsewhere, inflate, or borrow dearer. None is pain-free. If politics cannot pick, markets do it for you. That was Britain's story from 1947 to 1956 to 1976. It is the risk the U.S. faces if fiscal consolidation never arrives. Signals to monitor are concrete. Track net interest versus defense quarter by quarter. Watch the share of global reserves in dollars and the volume of commodity invoices settled off dollar. Follow the uptake of alternative rails for cross-border payments and liquidity lines among non-U.S. counterparties. Observe whether the Pentagon quietly shutters or consolidates forward bases. Note whether budgets hard cap procurement cycles or defer maintenance. Those are the operational tells of retrenchment. Finally, watch the bond market's term premium and auction tails. Sustained stress there telegraphs rising rollover risk. For households and investors, the playbook is pragmatic. A large, sudden devaluation like Britain's 30% cut in 1949 punishes domestic cash claims. Portfolio construction that assumes dollar exceptionalism can misprice currency risk. Diversification across currencies and across real assets offers partial insurance. So, do investments in human capital and portable skills, which hold value regardless of exchange rates. Redundancy in income streams and location options adds optionality if policy shocks cascade. The deeper lesson is not ideological, it is mechanical. Empires overreach because the short-run benefits of projection are visible while the long-run financing costs are abstract. Compound interest and external balances eventually convert abstractions into deadlines. Britain tried to finesse the math with selective defaults, controlled devaluations, and diplomatic appeals. In the end, creditors set the timetable. Great powers lose autonomy not when they lose battles, but when they lose pricing power over their own money. America still has choices. It can restore primary balance over the cycle, align defense posture with resources, and preserve dollar incumbency by keeping markets deep, open, and predictable. Or it can pretend the constraints do not exist, gambling that scale alone will save it. History's answer is consistent. Bills come due. The decision is reform or reckoning. Important differences temper the analogy. The U.S. economy is vastly larger relative to global GDP than Britain's was at its zenith. Its internal market and innovation base generate scale Britain never possessed. The Treasury market is the world's benchmark collateral, embedded in derivatives, bank liquidity buffers, and central bank reserves. Energy independence is higher than in past cycles. Geography insulates the homeland from peer invasion risks that haunted Britain in 2 world wars. U.S. firms dominate key technologies, semiconductors design, cloud platforms, AI models, aerospace, and those rents support the external account. These edges buy time. They do not repeal budget identities. Primary deficits plus interest must be financed. Triggers for a regime shift are, by nature, unpredictable. Candidates include a large war that elevates deficits while disrupting trade, a domestic political crisis that threatens debt ceiling resolution, a banking shock that forces rapid balance sheet expansion, or a coordinated decision by a handful of major reserve managers to shorten duration. Any of these could push yields sharply higher and induce a dollar slide, producing the very conditions that encourage further diversification away from dollar assets. That is how feedback loops begin. The British timeline offers a caution on speed, from apparent stability in 1938 to rationing and convertibility failure by 1947, less than a decade passed. From initial military success in Egypt to capitulation under financial pressure in 1956, it took days. From pride in domestic management to an IMF letter of intent in 1976, it took a market quarter. Change feels glacial until it is sudden. Policy options map directly to the balance sheet. You can raise revenue, cut spending, grow the base, or inflate. Sustainable fixes combine all 4. Revenue can be broadened by base widening rather than rate spikes. Spending can prioritize investments with positive multipliers and prune low-value entitlements. Pro-growth reforms can lift productivity. Monetary policy must avoid the trap of financial repression that quietly taxes savers while eroding confidence. None of this is easy. All of it is easier than crisis management after confidence breaks. For individual risk management, operationalize the advice. Diversify savings vehicles across custody jurisdictions where practical. Hold some inflation-resilient assets with low counterparty risk. Keep duration flexible. If rates lurch, the ability to rotate matters. Invest in skills with global portability. If you run a business, stress test cash flows for higher rates and slower demand. Build liquidity buffers. Secure multiple supplier and distribution channels. Treat resilience as a process, not a one-time purchase. Finally, keep perspective. Decline is not destiny. Britain after Suez became a prosperous democracy with a high standard of living and a deep financial sector, but it ceded strategic autonomy. America can avoid that fate if it respects constraints early. Empires end in grand narratives. Balance sheets end in arithmetic. The math is what matters. Watch the signals, act early, and build margins of safety. History rewards preparation, not presumption.